Sounds of laughter and fluttering pages caught in the gentle pollen-dusted breeze. The golden rays of the setting sun trapped themselves in the wine glasses lifted up to it like so many fallen stars. Bees staggered lazily in the air nearby, unsure if these colourful apparitions were flowers or something other, something spectral. The apparitions themselves took no notice of the bees, the sun, or the breeze that surrounded them. They were the centre and the whole of their world, a world that smelled of countryside and ink, a world that sounded like pen and pages and scandal, a world built on the foundations of the other. They called themselves the Bloomsbury Group, and it was in this group that the late Virginia Woolf made her home. I think I just became possessed by the spirit of every cottagecore girl at once. Hi, my name is Mia, and thank you for listening to my gay little history series, Rainbow Relics. This is another episode about an author because gays can't do maths, Alan Turing is an outlier, and need other worlds to unleash their queer agenda into. So, without further ado, allow me to trace out for you the life of Adeline Virginia Woolf. Nobody can say Virginia Woolf didn't lead an interesting life, but that strange allure started in her parents, before she was born and before they had even met each other. In my opinion, the situation surrounding her parents, Leslie Stephen and Julia Jackson, meeting each other is a little suspicious. From 1882 to 1891, Leslie Stephen worked as the first editor for the Dictionary of National Biography. He had one child who he became the sole provider of once his wife died unexpectedly. Julia Jackson, niece to the famous portrait photographer Julia Margaret, was a networker and had many connections and friends in the 19th century art scene. She was left as the sole provider of 3 children when, suddenly, her husband died. Leslie and Julia married each other in 1878. Look, okay, their respective ex-spouses died 5 years apart from each other, but the whole dying unexpectedly thing still sounds a little bit weird to me. Regardless, both seemed very happy together and went to have 4 more children between them. I know families were big back in the day, but for one woman to give birth 7 times? That sounds like a lot. Julia Jackson, she's kind of amazing for that, I think. But their first child, Vanessa, was born a year after they married, and a year after that, their first son, Toby, was born. 2 years later, Virginia joined the family, and a year after that, Julia finally decided she had had enough of all of this after the birth of her youngest son, Adrian. All 8 children, Virginia and her full siblings, as well as the half-siblings, lived in the same house, and there was a clear divide of sides. Virginia and her full siblings always sided with each other against the half-siblings, but that didn't mean that all 4 of them were the best friends at all times. Virginia especially loathed her little brother Adrian for being their mother's favorite and gaining all her attention, so much so that it compelled her to begin a family newspaper. As far as I can tell, this is her earliest introduction to writing. The newspaper was called Hyde Park Gate News, and since Virginia had yet to learn the art of unbiased journalism at age 9, the paper was notorious for making fun of both Adrian and Virginia's older sister, Vanessa. Even though most of the time Vanessa was almost a mother figure to Virginia, in their childhood there was a heated battle between their artistic prowess. Virginia always wanted her writing to be better than Vanessa's paintings. Her paper did more than just tease her siblings. It served as a way for academics now to understand how Virginia saw her childhood and how it affected her writing later in life. Her family summered on the Cornwall coast in a place called Tallet House, and this change of scenery cemented the idea of opposites in both Virginia's personality and her art. She lived in both the city and the country, around the repression of modernity and the freedom of nature, the fragmentation of a working family, and the wholeness that holidays provided. However, this black and white perception was shattered for Virginia upon the death of her mother. Julia was 49 and Virginia only 13. The Hyde Park Gate News fell silent as Virginia and the rest of her family suffered in grief. The first introduction to death hit Virginia hard, and it took her a full year before she could bring herself to show joy again. But this state was fragile and shattered easily when her half-sister Stella died almost 2 years later. In 1904, at the death of her father, Virginia's mental health began its steep decline. I'm really sorry, I forgot to mention this in my first recording, but please be advised that this episode does talk a lot about mental health and suicide. If these are sensitive topics for you, please take care of yourself and stop listening now. Her father died when she was 22, and young Virginia was so distraught that she threw herself out of the window of her house. The window wasn't very high and definitely not enough to do much damage, and she only spent a short stay in hospital after the event. It is speculated that Virginia suffered from bipolar disorder, or manic depression. Both Virginia's parents suffered from mental illnesses. Her father was cyclothymic, a milder version of manic depression, and her mother was depressed. Her father's father was also cyclothymic, and after a manic episode had been institutionalized. Virginia's half-sister Laura was psychotic. Both Adrian and Vanessa were cyclothymic, and Toby suffered from hypomanic episodes. With such a strong trend of mental illnesses in her family, sadly, it is not surprising that Virginia was suffering from bipolar disorder. This next part does get very difficult, so I want to stress again that please, if you are not comfortable with trauma or abuse or anything of that nature, please stop listening. I need you to look after yourself first and foremost. It is said that her symptoms could have been exacerbated by both the trauma of seeing so many people close to her dying while she was still young, and the trauma inflicted on her by her half-brothers George and Gerald Duckworth. For 9 years, she suffered sexual abuse from both of them, first being molested by Gerald when she was 6 years old. The same year her mother died, George began assaulting Virginia too. And these weren't malicious but otherwise ignorant children either. George was 15 years older than Virginia, and Gerald 16 years older. They knew exactly what they were doing, and Virginia became scared and isolated from this, writing about her encounters and feelings of fear, pain, and shame in her diary. She tried to heal herself by writing, and academics usually point to The Wise Virgins, one of her books, to support this theory. When it came time for Virginia to want to start her own family, however, she was told by her doctors not to. Her mental health was too fragile, and this news only served to devastate Virginia even more. Virginia was institutionalized from 1910 to 1913 under a program of rest-cure therapy, which involved her sleeping, removing herself from challenging intellectual situations, and gaining weight. She hated the institution, but she allowed herself to be subject to the therapy, knowing it would help her and that the alternative would be worse. Her second suicide attempt, though, came in the form of an attempted poisoning in 1913 when she was 31, but since her husband was nearby, she was taken to hospital and had her stomach pumped. Her husband, Leonard Woolf, was also one of Virginia's closest friends and an immense support for her in her most difficult and trying depressive episodes. They met each other back in 1904 after Virginia and her full siblings had moved house to Bloomsbury, away from their Duckworth half-siblings after the death of Leslie. Leonard had dinner with and was entertained by the family before being posted in Sri Lanka as a colonial administrator. He returned 7 years later, and after resigning from colonial service, he and Virginia married in August of 1912. Leonard went from being a high-ranking official in the army to becoming a writer advocating peace everywhere. He loved the art of writing as much as his wife, but where Virginia focused on pushing creative boundaries, Leonard became infatuated with the mechanical art of print. On the 24th of April, 1917, the Hogarth Press was born. Barely a month later, their first publication was released to the public. Called Two Stories, it featured just that, one of the stories being written by Leonard and another by Virginia. Hogarth Press became an immense part of their lives. What started as a little private drawing room operation soon spread to their dining room, and by the end of it all became a subsidiary of the massive Penguin Random House. Between 1917 and 1946, they published, by hand, more than 500 different titles. Famously, they were approached by James Joyce to publish his novel Ulysses, but they had to turn him down as the whole book was far too long for the Woolfs to handprint. The Woolfs expected their press, which allowed their writer friends to publish their stories closer to home, to strengthen personal bonds. They expected that blending personal and business relationships would be beneficial to both sides of the arrangement. But soon they learned how mistaken they were. Granted, having so many ties to new authors helped keep their printing press afloat during the war era, where a lot of other small publications began to go under. But the criticism they had to impart to their friends hurt those relationships. After 2 stories, Hogarth Press published Catherine Mansfield's book Prelude, but conversations around the publication left the relationship frayed at best. By March 1924, Virginia found self-publication to be just as nerve-wracking as seeking out an external publisher. In October 1933, she officially stopped working as a publisher, leaving all of the work to her husband. Leonard still thrived with the mechanical work and the press continued, but the Hogarth Press was not finished its attack on Virginia. In 1934, Vita Sackville West presented Hogarth Press with her novel The Dark Island. Virginia hated the book so much that she broke off her affair with Vita. Who was Vita Sackville West exactly? What was her connection to Virginia? Let's abandon Leonard to his printing press and focus on the queer part of this queer person of history. So, Vita Sackville West met Virginia Woolf after ending a 10-year-long relationship with the author Violet Trefusis. Why were so many women given names that started with V? Vita, Vanessa, Virginia, Violet. Do you guys have any idea how confusing my notes became because of these 4? But if you're listening to this, I obviously managed to get through it. At first, the relationship between Vita and Virginia was very one-sided. Vita almost idolized Virginia in her creativity and intellect. Virginia, on the other hand, overlooked Vita and her subpar writing. Despite this cold start on the 15th of December 1922 and the culmination of their affair in 1934, both women stayed friendly right up until Virginia's death. And their tumultuous relationship became the fodder for biographies, a West End play, a 2019 film, and even one of Virginia's most successful books. The women met at a social, and Virginia all but overlooked Vita, and thus it was Vita who, in her charming and persuasive way, invited Virginia to dinner parties with her. Much unlike her usual personality, Virginia did go to these events and gradually began to warm up to Vita. In a letter penned to her husband on the 19th of December 1922, Vita stated that Virginia absolutely fascinated and entranced her. At 40 years old, with 3 published novels and 3 survived depressive episodes under her belt, it is no small feat to understand why Virginia was such an entrancing figure to the younger Vita. As their bond grew closer and stronger, Virginia would be heralded as the far better writer of the two, while socialite Vita was the more accomplished woman. It did still take some time for their relationship to become truly romantic, as shy Virginia stayed guarded to Vita's advances, which Vita read as further mystery and intrigue of her character. There was a break in the early stages of their relationship when Vita's mercurial personality compelled her to pursue the architectural historian Geoffrey Scott, but this did not last long. Both women were married when they met, and Vita had multiple extramarital affairs which her husband, Harry Nicholson, knew all about. Both women were in open marriages. While this was not common at the time, and in fact frowned upon, this freedom of theirs was found through the Bloomsbury Group. This was a group of young artists, writers, and critics who wanted to hide from the world and indulge in art as best they could. If you listen to the Oscar Wilde episode I did, you'll notice how similar this sounds to the aesthetic movement. But while the aesthetic movement swept the entire Western world, the Bloomsbury Group was confined to one clique of socialites. In 1905, Vanessa Stephen, Virginia's older sister, founded the Friday Club. This was a gathering of artists that met in the privacy of her house every Friday. Shocker, I know. At a similar time, Virginia's younger brother Toby started a group of writers with his college friends that met on Thursdays. The introduction of Roger Fry, a man destined to be one of Vanessa's lovers, in 1910 became important in solidifying the appeal and social standings of both groups. In 1912, after an art show curated by Vanessa and Duncan Grant, the groups merged under the collective name of Bloomsbury. And do you know what else the groups did in 1910 besides introducing one of the most influential art critics into the fold? They participated in blackface. Yes, sadly, you heard me right. When I first saw this in my research, I suspected it of being a hoax. But unfortunately, this is not the case. On the 7th of February 1910, Virginia Woolf, her brother Adrian, and 2 other members of the Bloomsbury group donned turbans, fake beards, and painted their skin, all in an attempt to impersonate the Emperor of Abyssinia and his entourage. Alongside these 4 were 2 other members of the group, posing as their British escorts. They learned barely a handful of phrases in Swahili for their prank, and strode up to the British Navy vessel, the HMS Dreadnought. The Navy greeted the group with a red carpet welcome and paraded the ship to them, many unaware of the elaborate and very offensive hoax. When they left, they were escorted to a lavish carriage, but in their quick getaway, their beards allegedly fell off their faces. Learning that they had been duped, most of the naval officers were outraged, but the captain allegedly found the whole event rather amusing. The offensive nature of the event became almost a hallmark of the Bloomsbury group and their disregard for authority and social standing, which brought them under much scrutiny. Their art, which helped pave the way for the modernist movement, was deeply critiqued, and I wish I could say this was directly due to the Dreadnought blackface incident, but I suspect it had far more to do with their free love ethos. You know, the part of the group that celebrates love between consenting adults regardless of marital status or gender, that's the part society decided to drag them for. And their whole group really does give me enough queer people to publish episodes on that could easily take me the rest of the year. But after the Dreadnought, I don't know if I want to. But, okay, breathing, I'm getting back on track to a topic that doesn't fill me with rage. The fraternity of the Bloomsbury group, which left Vita and Virginia to explore their relationship unfettered. Okay, lesbians, racists, we're back, we're fine. And explore, I guess they did. In 1924, their relationship finally turned from a will they, won't they, Barbie-style friendship into a flirtatious romance. In May of that year, when Virginia was still invested in the Hogarth Press, she asked Vita to write a book for her. The resulting novel, Seducers in Ecuador, thrilled Virginia, especially when she found Vita had dedicated it especially to her. They exchanged letters that grew in intimacy for 2 years, strengthening their emotions for one another as each was exchanged. But Virginia hadn't realized how hard she had fallen for this other woman until January of 1926. Harold Nicholson, Vita's husband, who, again, knew of and consented to the relationship, as did Leonard Woolf, was stationed at an army outpost away, and Vita was to go with him. Vita told Virginia of this arrangement in September of the previous year, and both women decided to steal away together for 3 nights in Kent in December 1925. This was a pretty big step in their relationship, as it was the longest both women had been alone together, and even slept together for the first time. Remember Virginia's diary? Not even the most blind of historians could dispel claims of their romantic relationship at this point. After Vita returned from the army station with Harold, their relationship was reignited, and their letters to one another were a mix of deep emotion and playful teasing. They came up with nicknames for one another. Vita was Donkey West, and Virginia was Potto. Love that name. But their affair was not exclusive, at least not to the free-spirited Vita. In October 1927, she started seeing Mary Campbell alongside Virginia Woolf. She tried to hide this, but observant Virginia could not be fooled for long. Vita's attention lapsed, and this struck panic in Virginia. In a desperate attempt to get her back, she drafted the idea of one of her most influential books, Orlando. gonna quickly add here that Orlando is also like a 1990 something movie with Tilda Swinton, and it was my first introduction to anything by Virginia Woolf, and I absolutely adore it, and I don't know if it's because it's a good story or if it's just Tilda Swinton, but maybe check that out, just as an idea. On October 9, 1927, Virginia wrote a letter to Vita. In it, she confessed that she knew all about Mary Campbell, and she wanted to write Vita's biography. Vita instantly agreed, but during the whole creation of Orlando, she wasn't allowed to read a word of it. When it was finally published as the first biographical fiction in 1928, Vita adored it. Her son would later call it the longest and most charming love letter in literature. It solidified to both women the deep understanding they had for one another. But even with this love letter, their relationship as a romantic one would not last. In 1934, Vita presented Virginia and the Hogarth Press with her book The Dark Island. Virginia loathed the book to the point where their affair was ended. At the start of the Second World War, Virginia's mental health grew increasingly more fragile. Vita had moved to Sissinghurst Castle in Kent, physically pushing them away. But unlike Virginia, Vita thrived in the war, going so far as to volunteer as an ambulance driver. In the letters that were exchanged between the two women from London to Kent and back, a fight was sparked. The publication of Virginia's book 3 Guineas in 1938 denounced the war and caused a political rift between the women. As the war raged on, however, bigger problems arose. Virginia lost her creativity due to the stress and deprivation the war caused, and no matter what Leonard did to try soothe his wife or the friendship Vita kept with her, the deprivation and depression overwhelmed Virginia. In 1941, Virginia Woolf slipped into the deepest depression of her life. On the 28th of March, at the age of 59, fearing both her age and her loss of creativity, Virginia filled her pockets with stones. She walked into the river Ouse behind her house and drowned. Both Leonard and Vita blamed themselves for the death of Virginia. Leonard scolded himself on not being watchful enough. Vita hated herself for growing distant from Virginia and not being able to gauge just how much pain the war was causing her. I don't think anything could have prevented Virginia's suicide, but through her life, all the negative and positive aspects, she left behind a legacy that changed the direction of the life of English literature. Before I actively started researching Woolf and her life, I had a much clearer picture in my head of how I thought of her. I'd studied her works in some courses, and she was this influential, creative, forward-thinking, middle-class woman. I had no idea about the levels of trauma that she faced or the offensive pranks is such a horrible word for this, offensive shows that she put on with the Bloomsbury group. And the Dreadnought incident is the biggest one of these, but it isn't the only one of these. And I come back feeling conflicted about my feelings for her. Yes, she was this amazing, influential writer, and she's got one of the first lesbian books, she's got one of the first trans books, and she was never quiet about her sexuality, and for that I applaud her, but that doesn't excuse her from the levels of oppression that she appropriated. Is appropriated the right word? I don't know. I don't have coercive thoughts on this part. This is just free whatevering. But yeah, I don't know if... She's not forgivable, but should she be cancelled, quote unquote, for the things that she did? I don't know, I'm not the best person, I'm not a person at all to be speaking on this, but it does leave me very confused as to where I stand with the whole issue with her. I'm just gonna leave it at that, I think. Thank you for listening, and apologies for my little angry burst. And I hope that you learned something new here today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, whatever you're doing. Thank you.